From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome. My name is David Mao, and I have the pleasure of welcoming all of you to the Library of Congress today. What a beautiful day it is to be here, and we are very, very pleased that on this beautiful day we have the pleasure of welcoming Professor Nicholas Vincent to the library for his lecture titled Magna Carta, From Runnymede to Washington, Old Laws, New Discoveries. This program is the final lecture in a series that the Law Library of Congress here at the Library of Congress launched last year to explore Magna Carta's impact on various topics, historical and contemporary. And the series we launched was co-sponsored by the American Bar Association Standing Committee on the Law Library of Congress. And I'd just like to acknowledge Liz Medaglia, who's the current chair. So Liz, if you want to wave to everybody, because they very much supported us through this endeavor, and as a co-sponsor, we're very, very appreciative to the ABA Standing Committee. So as I'd mentioned, the launch of this lecture series coincided with the Law Library, or I should say the Library of Congress exhibition, Magna Carta, Muse, and Mentor, which we opened in November of last year and closed earlier this year in January. I hope many of you had the opportunity to see that exhibit during 10 weeks. As many of you probably know, we had on exhibition here the 1215 Lincoln Cathedral King John Magna Carta, along with many, many items from the Library of Congress's collection that help to tell the story and illustrate Magna Carta's influence here in the United States, and in particular political liberty here in the United States. Well, we're very fortunate to have Dr. Vincent close out our lecture series as our tribute to Magna Carta, and as we now lead up to the actual 800th anniversary in June of this year. Dr. Vincent, as all of you know, is the scholar on Magna Carta in the world, and so we're just very, very delighted that he agreed to come and join us today. He's a medieval history scholar from the University of East Anglia in the United Kingdom, and my understanding is that today he's going to provide us with some insight on Magna Carta copies held throughout the world, and also here in DC. The meaning and history of the Great Charter and the many peculiar ways that the legend of Magna Carta has been exploited throughout the centuries. As you see from your program notes, in 2007, Professor Vincent was a special advisor for Sotheby's sale of the 1297 Magna Carta that's currently on display just down the road at the National Archives. Professor Vincent was trained at Oxford and has held chairs or fellowships at leading universities around the world. He's the author of more than 100 scholarly articles and a dozen books. In fact, just this past December, Professor Vincent was responsible for the discovery of yet another previously unknown Magna Carta, and I believe we're going to hear a little bit about that today. It was in the archives of the English borough of Sandwich, and it's just amazing that we were able to find that during this run of celebration of Magna Carta. So with that, I hope you will join me in welcoming Professor Vincent to the podium for this very special lecture. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much, and thank you very much for coming here on Easter Monday. What I also understand is the opening of the baseball season, which is not a sport much associated with Magna Carta, but I understand entirely why there might be difficulties with people attending. David's already referred to this wonderful exhibition that you had, Magna Carta, Muse and Mentor, that's been running at the Library of Congress this year. Earlier this month, though, we had the opening in London of our Magna Carta exhibition. You got Princess Anne, we got her brother, her elder brother, I should say, Prince Charles. And he gave a very good introduction to our exhibition, which includes several items borrowed from your collection. And here is Claire Bray of the British Library showing Prince Charles, his ancestor, King John, the king who granted Magna Carta. And I would advise you there to look particularly at King Charles's tongue, which is very firmly in his cheek at this point, because what he's looking at there is also King John's teeth, which we are able to exhibit as part of our exhibition in London. which were found in King John's grave when it was excavated in the 1790s. And along with King John's teeth, we also have King John's thumb bone, which presumably he used to hold down the parchment of Magna Carta at the time that Magna Carta was signed at Runnymede. Now, here, as it were, we begin to get to the beginning of the problem of Magna Carta that I'm going to deal with today, the distinction between Magna Carta in reality and Magna Carta in myth. Because, as you probably know, King John did not actually sign Magna Carta using a quill pen. That didn't prevent the Royal Mint, the manufacturer of official British currency, earlier this year, putting out a coin in which King John is shown holding in one hand the parchment on which he's about to write Magna Carta, and in the other, this big pen that he's going to use to sign it. Again, a sign that this mythology has polluted even the most significant of streams. Now, I'm delighted to tell you that you in Washington got this right in 1934 when you came to make those great bronze doors 17 foot high for the American Supreme Court. And there you have King John not signing Magna Carta with a pen, but using something a bit like those stamps that they use in immigration today when you come through customs at Dulles Airport. He's using what it actually is, a medieval seal press to sign the Charter. And that should serve as a reminder that Magna Carta in many ways is totemized and has been turned into an icon for American audiences to an even greater extent than is the case in England. There we have the Supreme Court in Washington with its great bronze doors, but inside the Supreme Court we have the North Wall frieze, Adolf Weinmann, 1934, which shows not King John, but a baron holding Magna Carta. And next to him, of course, is an angel of liberty or justice, and on the right-hand side of him is St. Louis, the inventor of French royal laws, again as some indication of the way in which Magna Carta has been totemized, turned into an icon in America. Now that tradition, and again, look at that seal press, look at the accuracy with which an American audience was keen to get these details correct as early as 1915, that use of Magna Carta as a symbol can be found across the United States. Here we are in the state capitol at Madison in Wisconsin. Here we're in Cleveland, Ohio, in a rather more socialist environment with Frank Brangwyn's great Magna Carta mural. I'm afraid I can only give you the left-hand side of it, but this is a mural that shows, as it were, the common people receiving Magna Carta rather than the barons. Here we are in Indiana in 1935 in the Terre Haute Federal Building, again with a great depiction of Magna Carta as part of a state Supreme Court. And notice here that in Indiana, where they do things rather differently, King John is indeed shown signing Magna Carta with a large pen. Now, quite how King John is going about signing or sealing Magna Carta here in the National Cathedral in New York, I'm not sure. This is the so-called Canterbury pulpit, which was made out of stone brought from Bell Harry Tower in Canterbury Cathedral, given by the Archbishop of Canterbury to New York in 1907. King John is looking there rather surprised, rather as if he's having his tickets checked on Amtrak or something along those lines, but certainly he's doing something with Magna Carta, even in the National Cathedral. And here we are in 1959 in the Los Angeles Supreme Court. Well, we've disposed of kings and feudalism here, but we've still got a rather remarkable baron holding Magna Carta as one of those totemic, iconic symbols of liberty, even in the Los Angeles Superior Court as late as the 1950s. Now, that should serve as a reminder that in many ways, Magna Carta is fetishized in America in a way out of all proportion to the degree to which it's remembered or commemorated in England. Today, only 3.5 of the clauses of the 1215 Magna Carta are still operative in English law, and they operate, as we'll come on to see, not through the 1215 Charter, but through its later reissues. By contrast, in America, beginning in South Carolina in 1836, and most recently in North Dakota, as recently as 1943, the entire text of Magna Carta has been incorporated within state statute books. In other words, far more of Magna Carta is operative or active under American law than is the case in the United Kingdom. And that should serve as a reminder also that there is a physical connection between Magna Carta and America. Princess Anne here, opening your Library of Congress exhibition, the high point of that exhibition was the display of the Lincoln Magna Carta, one of the 4 original 1215 Magna Cartas that survive in the United Kingdom, all of which have World Heritage status thanks to the United Nations. Here you have the Lincoln Magna Carta that you were able to exhibit for the last few months. But that Lincoln Magna Carta has been traveling backwards and forwards across the Atlantic for a very long time. It first came to America in 1939, and here you can see Lord Lothian, who was then the British ambassador in Washington, and the then Librarian of Congress, Archibald MacLeish, taking possession of Magna Carta in a year, 1939, not without significance for the wider history of European affairs. That Lincoln Magna Carta, brought to New York in 1939, was brought as part of a deliberate propaganda program to involve America in the affairs of Europe at a very dark moment, with Europe poised on the cusp of a new world war and a desire to ensure American aid for liberties and freedoms threatened by Nazi Germany in 1939. Magna Carta was closely guarded at the New York World's Fair and was there visited by King George VI and Queen Elizabeth, the mother of the present Queen, at the British Pavilion in June 1939. You'll see there that they got the dates slightly wrong, so they turn up 4 days late for the real commemoration of Magna Carta, which you should know is the 15th of June, not the 19th. That World Fair was in part a celebration of the world of tomorrow, of this bright new American future that was opening up in the 1930s. This is the road of tomorrow as exhibited in the World's Fair in New York in 1939, familiar to many of you if you look out of the window. Far more familiar, I suspect, is Futurama, which was the World Fair's view of what the future city was going to look like. And I'm terribly sorry to say that as a result of RAF and Luftwaffe redesigning of large parts of Europe after 1939, in fact, this was the model city of large parts of Europe at the end of the Second World War. Perhaps less prophetic in the sense that it never came quite into reality was the Westinghouse Hall of Electrical Living displayed at the New York Fair with Electro, the Westinghouse Moto Man, with his 26 mechanical movements. You can see the vast crowd. Forget about Magna Carta. They want to see Electro. 26 mechanical movements. He could walk, he could talk, and we are in 1939. He could also smoke a cigarette. Well, Magna Carta was displayed as part of that World's Fair, the Lincoln Magna Carta, uniting the old world and the new. And that attempt to unite the old world and the new continued through to the 1970s, so that for the bicentennial celebrations of 1976, the British government commissioned a famous jeweller, a man named Louis Osman, to make for the Rotunda in Capitol a gold leaf reproduction of Magna Carta, embedded in a Yorkshire sandstone, surmounted, and I'm reading this caption because this is not a stone with which I am familiar, surmounted by a block of pegmatite, a rare 3 billion-year-old volcanic stone from the Outer Hebrides. Forget about 800 years. We can also do 3 billion-year-old stone. 1975 and its tastes being unlike the tastes of any other time before or after in human history, this item is now no longer on display in the rotunda, but lurks in splendour in the crypt. But in 2007, David Rubenstein, at auction in New York, bought back for deposit in the National Archives the original Magna Carta that had been bought in the 1980s by Ross Perot and had been deposited in this library for the previous 25 years. And that's really where I come in, because I was involved in that sale as a special advisor to Sotheby's. I wrote a long catalogue on Magna Carta, which is really where my interest first emerged. I'm going to try now to explain to you something of the British background here, which is significant if we're to understand the reality of this document, rather than the mythology, the totemization of this document in America. That, as you may well know, is the so-called burnt Magna Carta. It's one of 4 original 1215 Magna Cartas held in England. It's one of 2 in the British Library. And I think, as an icon, it itself is very significant because it should remind us of the fragility of law and liberty. In our present exhibition in the British Library, there's a wonderful moment. You travel through these 800 years of superstructure, all these things that have been built on the basis of Magna Carta, and then you arrive in a sort of dark anteroom at the very end of it. And all there is in there is that thing, this burnt shred of parchment, terribly damaged by fire in the 1730s, even more damaged by restoration in the 1820s. And I found that really rather moving, because what you have there is some indication of the fragility of this document, without which the English-speaking world would be rather different. That document came into existence through the misdeeds of one particular man. This is the English King John from his tomb at Worcester. And the big question with King John is, why was he so evil? What did he do that was so bad? The really bad thing that King John did, as far as the English were concerned, and it's one of the bad things that English politicians have continued to do ever afterwards, was that he lost our empire. From 1066 onwards, England was governed as part of a trans-maritime empire. Normans conquered England and then ruled England and Normandy as part of a joint stock venture. And in all the good 19th century Victorian maps of that empire, it is coloured pink because it was the first British empire, an empire in France. In 1204, King John, through his own lack of justice and his own military incompetence, lost that great estate. Just as kings who won their battles clearly showed that they had God on their side, so kings who lost their battles clearly demonstrated that they had lost the favour of God. That was the worst thing that King John did. But he did other things beside that were almost as bad. Now, to govern his great empire, the king had to use letters. He had to use written instructions sent out to his ministers. The king might be in England, but governing in France. He might be in France, but governing in England. He had to communicate by letter, by charter, with his ministers. And Magna Carta, the big charter, is just the biggest and best and most legally significant of a whole succession of thousands of these documents issued year on, year out by the kings of England. And like Magna Carta, those letters and documents were sealed by the kings of England using their great seal. On one side, it showed the king seated in majesty, a symbol of justice and equity. On the other side, it showed the king as he really was, riding into battle with a great big sword to beat up his enemies and maintain his lands. King John's failure to fulfill the promises of either side of his seal was really his undoing. Above and beyond that, King John was also a tyrant who, in 1202, was widely reputed to have murdered his own nephew. King John came to the throne in slightly difficult circumstances as the younger brother of the previous king, the hero Richard the Lionheart. Richard had a young nephew, Arthur of Brittany, who was 15 years old at the time, but King John swiped the kingdom. In 1202, Arthur rebelled against John, and John took Arthur prisoner. What happened thereafter is not at all clear. Arthur just disappeared. But the general assumption made by contemporaries was that King John had actually murdered his own nephew. Now, this was a very dysfunctional family at the best of times, and in the past, the Plantagenet family had regularly locked people away or blinded them or castrated them or done all sorts of terrible things to nephews and brothers. But they hadn't actually murdered them. King John went a step too far. And it was that step too far in 1202 that led to the rebellion of 1204, in which King John lost his empire. So in both respects in which medieval kings were supposed to succeed, as the upholders of justice and as the maintainers of the territorial integrity of their lands, as imperialists, John proved himself an outright failure. His response was to attempt to build up a war chest, to assemble a vast treasure in order to pay for a reconquest of the lands that he'd lost in France in 1204. And to do that, he used the resources of his government, the exchequer, the checkered counting cloth that was used to count the money as it came into the king, and the chancery, the writing office of the kings of England that produced the king's letters and charters. Now, modern historians are inclined to ask how we know all this. Surely medieval historians, they suggest, just make all this stuff up. This is a very long time ago. How can we know anything about it? We know about it because King John, being paranoid, kept copies of his outgoing correspondence. And those copies, this is merely one amongst 4 rolls of this sort of proportion for 1 year, 1217, and this is, 1216, the last year of King John's reign. It's the year 17 King John. This roll is one of 4 for that year, and those are replicated year after year from the time of the king's succession in 1199. And if we begin to zoom in on that vast tide of parchment record keeping, if we begin to look at the sheer number of letters that are reported each year for this king, we have tens of thousands of letters of King John copied into the central archives of government that enable us to work out what the king was actually like. And zooming in on this particular one, here we go close up and closer still, we also begin to get some idea of the temper and morals of that court. What we've got here is a court clerk bored in the summer of 1216, doing what many of you are already beginning to do now with your programme, doodling. Here using a quill pen and some ink rather than the biro or whatever you've got, but he's doodling nonetheless. And what he's drawn is a picture of a crane, the bird, the crane. And he says in the Latin inscription to this picture, here is a picture of a mad crane, the bird, which looks just like the crane that you use for building. I saw that the rotunda is presently under repair. Well, the cranes that are being used for those repairs, this is the sort of building crane that this crane is being likened to. And then underneath it, he's put the name Philippa de Poten. Now, she was a woman who turned up at court in the summer of 1216, requesting justice on behalf of her husband, who had joined the rebels and had fallen out of favour with the king. The fact that the king's clerks, though, choose to doodle in the margins a really rather disrespectful picture of Philippa de Poten presented as a mad crane is some indication of the way in which even the King's Archive is turned in those dark winter evenings or those long summer afternoons into a sort of clubland betting book. Can you imagine the consequences of a Supreme Justice today doodling in the margins of his papers a picture of one of those many petitioners who go before the Supreme Court, doodling some disrespectful little cartoon? The law would never live it down. On the whole, those letters and charters of the king also reveal all sorts of other things about him. Now, I can't give you a close-up of this, but this is a famous record from earlier in the reign where the wife of the king's chief forester offers the king 1,000 chickens so that she may lie one night with her husband. Even in England today, the use of chickens to pay for sex is a very fringe activity. Back in the 13th century, one suspects likewise it was not very common. Quite what was going on here is not clear. Some have suggested that the forester's wife was the king's mistress and was paying to get out of the king's bed into the bed of her husband. Some have suggested that this was a joke and that what she's saying is, my husband is too busy on your business ever to spend time with me. So here are some chickens, can I have him back for the night? In either case, you see the way in which the private humour, indeed a rather cruel humour of the king and his court, is transposed onto these, in theory, official government documents. Now, this one I've given you in Latin, but it will be familiar to many of you in this room who have passwords for banking codes or for the internet or for all these other things for which we need passwords today. When the king locked up his nephew, Arthur of Brittany, he had set out a series of passwords that were to be used by anyone seeking access to Arthur. And what he's saying here is that somebody should be allowed into the prison where Arthur is being held, but they must use the password to do it. Unfortunately, the king has forgotten the password that he'd set, just as you often spend time on the telephone with the bank saying, I haven't got a clue what the telephone banking password number is, just give me the details I want. And what he's saying here, he's doing exactly what we do. He's bluffing. He's saying, I may not remember exactly what the password was, but I know there was a password, and anyway, I am the king. Let my person in. So far, so good. But the last line of that letter also has a bit of a punch, because it says, in effect, that some of these prisoners being held with Arthur should now be released, the king says, from the place where they are being held in fetters, by both their legs and their arms, and moved to the more comfortable place where they are held only in arm chains, which again is some indication of the reality, the rather seamier, the rather more violent reality of the court of King John. This was a king who could, in extremis, really lock you away in arm chains. What else did this king do wrong? Well, he was the son of a king widely reputed to have murdered his Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Becket, in 1170. That's something that even the presidents of America have generally avoided doing. The murder of archbishops or church leaders is not really a recommended political move. And it had, in the eyes of many, damned the Plantagenet dynasty as the sons of Belial, as the sons of the devil. As a result, in 1205, when the king tried to get his own candidate appointed Archbishop of Canterbury, the Pope, this is the Pope, Innocent III, refused to allow that to happen. There was then a standoff called the interdict between the church and state, in which the church, in effect, went on strike. For 6 years, the English clergy did not perform the ordinary functions of the Mass, marriage, all of the other sacraments. The king was declared an excommunicate. In that interval, the king built up a vast treasure. He was able now to exploit the lands not only of his barons and his knights, but also of the churchmen who'd gone into exile with the archbishop. And as a result, in 1214, he launched his great campaign of reconquest in France. And that great reconquest campaign ended on the 27th of July 1214, just outside the French city of Lille, at a place called Bouvines, a place that is as famous in French history as Hastings is in the history of England. Because at this battle, King John's army, not commanded by the king in person, but by his half-brother, King John's army was annihilated. King John, for the second time in his career, was shown to have forfeited the support of God, was forced to slink back into England, and it's from that defeat at Bouvines that the road stretched inexorably towards Runnymede. In May 1215, the discontented barons, determined no longer to pay taxation to the king, seized the city of London, the king's capital city, the source of his revenue. As a result, the king was forced to come to a compromise with them. He did so at the meadow of Runnymede on the Thames, halfway between London, and in the distance there you can see Windsor Castle, the castle where the king could retire in the evening to safety, to his own safe haven. We know an awful lot about those negotiations at Runnymede because even those contemporaries who were there preserved the remains of the negotiation. These things were treated even at the time almost as holy relics. This is an early form of the negotiations called the Articles of the Barons, and from that we move on to the text that we call Magna Carta. There are 4 originals of this 1215 text, of which you recently saw the Lincoln original. There's another one in Salisbury, and there are 2 more in the British Library. Most people who make a fuss about Magna Carta have never actually read the text, and there are things in the text that are quite surprising to those who've not read it. It is widely supposed that Magna Carta is a support in some way for democracy and is granted to all the free men of England. That is not the case. It says absolutely nothing about democracy. It's negotiated between king and barons, and it was granted not to the barons, but as you can see from this very opening clause that is still operative in English law today, we have first of all granted to God. This is a charter granted to God. Quite clearly, why it's granted to God is to prevent the king going back on it. Once you've given something to God, you can't really say, God, could I have back that £10 that I put in the collection plate last week? So God is incorporated into this charter, but so is the English church. The English church is to be free and to have its full rights and liberties. The fact that the Anglican church, the English church, in the 13th century Catholic Church, is actually there, hardwired into Magna Carta, created problems later on, as did the fact that Magna Carta is witnessed by a whole series of bishops. What do bishops and the English Church have to do with the Constitution of the United States of America? What does the City of London? Again, this is one of the 3.5 clauses still operative in English law. What does the City of London and its liberties that are protected by the Charter and are still protected by the Charter under English law today, what does that have to do with the rights of Wall Street or America? How can protecting the rights of one particular city, the oligarchic rights of a small city corporation, how can that, as it were, support the cause of democracy? There were clauses of that 1215 Magna Carta that can be seen as leading on to a democratic process. The idea of no taxation without representation. This clause, clause 14, allows that if the king charges new taxation, that taxation should be properly discussed and a proper council, what in due course we will go on to call Parliament, should be summoned to discuss it. This is clause 14 of Magna Carta. What is important to remember here is that this clause was operative in English law for at least 10 weeks. It was one of the very first clauses to be dropped from the Charter the moment the king could actually repudiate Magna Carta, as he did at the end of summer 1215. This clause was dropped from all subsequent reissues of the Charter and was never again law in England. Magna Carta really is remembered because of these 2 clauses. No free man will be taken or imprisoned or have his property taken away, or exiled or in any way ruined, nor shall we go or send against him, save by the lawful judgment of his peers and by the law of the land. To no one shall we sell, to no one shall we deny or delay right or justice. This is the origins of what we would today call due process, placing the king himself under the rule of law, so that the king cannot break his own laws. But what is wonderful about those clauses, and why those clauses are still operative today, is that they are so magnificently vague. What is the law of the land? Magna Carta doesn't set it out. It isn't a law book. What is judgment by your peers? Does that mean your equals? Does that mean if you're a rich man, you should be tried by a jury of other rich men, and if a poor man, by poor men? Who are your peers? What is the law? Magna Carta doesn't tell you any of that. What it does say, in the very most general terms, is that the king is under the law. And that principle, the principle of due process, as we shall very shortly see, is the principle that lived on long after this settlement at Runnymede had been consigned to the dustbin of history. Now, Magna Carta is very vague where we might most want it to be specific, and it is also specific where we might most want it to be vague. Very few of you in this audience today are threatened by fish weirs on the Thames or the Medway, and if you are, I suggest that you go to see a psychologist. But in the 13th century, the navigation of those rivers was very significant to the trade of the City of London, and therefore their specific rights were incorporated into the Charter. Very few of you will have heard of any of those people on that long list of names of French, alien, outside, foreign constables that Magna Carta demands be expelled from the land. Many years ago, I presided at a ceremony in Bury St Edmunds where they gave the freedom of the city of Bury to the American Air Force stationed outside. And as part of that ceremony, it was also intended to commemorate the anniversary of Magna Carta, they read out clauses of Magna Carta. So having given the American Air Forcemen the freedom of the city, they then read out Clause 51. After the restoration of peace, we will remove from the kingdom all foreign knights, crossbowmen, sergeants, and mercenaries, and Air Forcemen, presumably, who have come with horses, arms, and aeroplanes to the detriment of the kingdom. Very few of you will have heard of any of those names in that list, though you may know one of them. This is one of them, is a man named Philip Mark, who does appear down towards the bottom of that list. He's better known to you as the Sheriff of Nottingham, because in due course, either in the Disney version or in the Alan Rickman version, he appears in the Robin Hood legends, but not until the 15th century, not for another 300 years. The reason all those individuals were included in the 1215 Magna Carta was that they were the king's military might, his muscle, and those barons who wished the charter obeyed, in order to have it obeyed, had to get the king's force nullified. They had to destroy the military power of the king. That they entirely failed to do. Within 12 weeks, Magna Carta was a dead letter. It was repudiated by the king, the barons repudiated it and seized the castle of Rochester, the Pope declared it annulled. The king went to war with his barons. That should have been the end of the story. But the king died in the middle of that civil war. He died and was buried at Worcester. And as a means of buying support from the nation thereafter, the councillors gathered to support the king's 9-year-old son, the future King Henry III, decided that they would reissue Magna Carta. Now, not as a statement of the king's liabilities, not as a statement of the king's evils, but as a manifesto of future good government. It's in that reissue, now without about a third of the text of 1215, with all of the rather more specific things about lists of mercenary soldiers and peaces with Wales and Scotland and so forth, all of that cut out. It's in that later form that it was reissued without any more ado throughout the 13th century. In 1216 and 1217, it was sealed not only by the king's ministers, but by the papal legate, as if the Pope himself had sealed the document. It was reissued in 1225 in return for taxation. It was reissued in return for taxation to pay for the king's wars under King John's grandson, Edward I, in 1297, and then again by Edward I in 1300. It's that reissue of 1297 that you have in Washington, thanks to the generosity of David Rubenstein, who bought a 1297 Magna Carta at Sotheby's in 2007. In the meantime, from legend, Magna Carta had now become part of history. In the 17th century, it was widely used by English lawyers to defend the rights of the people against the Crown. Edward Coke, in particular, as Lord Chief Justice, used Magna Carta to argue that there was an ancient constitution that the King of England, Charles I, could not contravene. And the effects of that contravention were the deposition, the execution of Charles I in the 1640s. In the meantime, as part of the genetic birthright of those American settlers who came from England and settled on the East Coast from the early 17th century onwards, Magna Carta was carried into the American colonies. It was carried into Virginia in the form of the charter granted to Virginia by King James I. And as a result, the colonists of America acquired the rights of the common law that protected people at home in England. The common law, as is declared by this great plaque at Jamestown, crossed the Atlantic. So that in the 1760s and 70s, when kings of England began using their arbitrary powers to demand taxation from the American colonists to pay for their wars, those who stood up against them cited Magna Carta as part of their defense. In England, John Wilkes utilized Magna Carta as part of that propaganda campaign, and it was used likewise by the founding fathers in America. The idea of due process is incorporated not into the Declaration of Independence, but into the Bill of Rights thereafter. And as a result, in the 19th century, at least 17 of the states of the United States incorporated Magna Carta into their state constitutions. There are nonetheless problems with all of this. One of those is that Magna Carta is a settlement designed to oppose kings, full of feudal things like the church in England. The problem in the 1760s and 70s was not the king. Benjamin Franklin actually wanted the king to take over in person and rule America. The problem in the 1760s and 70s was Parliament. And Magna Carta, if it does anything, sets up Parliament rather than putting it down. Magna Carta is imbued with feudal language, so that the Jamaican slave plantation owners of the 1740s actually cited Magna Carta to justify the institution of slavery. Magna Carta Clause 20 defines the difference between the provisions that are to be made for free men and for villeins, for peasants, who those who wished to use Magna Carta to defend slavery could argue were equivalent to plantation slaves in modern-day America. In addition to this, there was the whole fact that, as you know, those of you who come from Washington, the British tourist industry in Washington, at least in 1812, was not really very well looked upon. So that besides burning the White House, in the American Civil War of the 1860s, the British government under W.E. Gladstone actually supported on the whole the southern states against the Union. And there was an almighty row about the Alabama, that ship that was supplied to the southern states, that took 65 prizes worth $6 million during the course of the American Civil War. In other words, to look to English liberties in the 1860s was a rather dangerous thing. Charles Sumner, the chairman of the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations, in the 1860s, after the Civil War, demanded the sum of $250 million from the British government in reparation for the Alabama incident. And as an alternative, he was prepared to accept the annexation of Canada. In other words, relations between England and America remained strained. Those attempts then to build Magna Carta into the American self-mythology came about really in reaction to all of that. And we find them operative from the 1880s onwards with things like the English-speaking Union. So here we have Winston Churchill in July 1918 declaring that the Declaration of Independence merely follows on from Magna Carta as one of the great title deeds on which the liberties of the English-speaking people are founded. Here we have Runnymede itself, which was donated to the people of England through the National Trust in the 1920s by this woman, Cara Broughton Lady Fairhaven, whose money came from Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company, in which her father, a humble paraffin seller, had developed a leading stake. And her husband, an Englishman, had introduced modern sewerage to the town of Fairhaven in Massachusetts. It was Lady Fairhaven who donated Runnymede to the English people, and since then it's been American money that has paid for the monumentalization of Runnymede. The American Bar Association Rotunda, the John F. Kennedy Memorial at Runnymede. There is far more of America at Runnymede than there is of England. Now, as it were, on to those things that have emerged recently, or at least in the last few years. One of the things I discovered when I came to write the catalogue for the Sotheby's sale in 2007 was that this document is so well known that everyone has assumed that everything about it must be known. And like many things in that situation, all of the most obvious things have often been ignored. It was in the course of that sale that I discovered the extraordinary story of Winston Churchill's attempt to give the Lincoln Magna Carta to the American people in 1941. Here we have Winston Churchill at the height of the Second World War trying to give the Lincoln Magna Carta that was on display in New York to America as a means of bringing America in on the side of England against the Germans. That plan failed only because the Dean and Chapter of Lincoln, you can see them here, and a very sinister bunch of men they look. The Dean and Chapter pointed out to Winston Churchill that it was actually their property, not his, to give away. It was in 2007, in writing that catalogue, that I found the tragic story of the Lincoln Magna Carta's return to England, where it was sent to the Public Record Office in London for repair and was there dampened with a sponge. And this is part of the letter written by the then official head of records in England to the Dean and Chapter, making up some complete nonsense balderdash about there being a fungoid infection that had somehow come about in New York or Washington or Fort Knox. What had actually happened was that the document had been dampened with a sponge. As a result, the Lincoln Magna Carta is faded. It has suffered as a result of its visits to Washington. Not as badly as the policemen suffered, who were blown up in the New York World Fair in 1940 in the English pavilion, the British pavilion, where a bomb went off, one assumes planted by a German sympathizer in 1940, killing 2 policemen. That was a story likewise that was not known. So was the story of Miss Talbot, who in 1946 gave her 1225 Magna Carta that had been preserved at Laycock Abbey in Wiltshire to the British Library. As part of the propaganda drive to again encourage American-English cooperation, after 1945, Miss Talbot was sent to America with her charter on tour. And I unearthed the correspondence that explained that if Miss Talbot stayed in a hotel, she was to be allowed $12 a night, but otherwise only $8. I dread to think what sort of hotel, even in 1945, you could stay in for $4 a night. Poor Miss Talbot. It was as part of that sale in 2007 that I unearthed the story of this extraordinary object in the rotunda, now consigned to the crypt of Congress. This extraordinary piece of pegmatite, rare 3 billion-year-old volcanic stone from the Outer Hebrides. I found the correspondence file in which the Air Force, the Royal Air Force, the air arm of the British Army, complained to the British government that they were being required to pluck this great boulder from the seashore of South Uist and transfer it to Washington. And one wonders what the reaction was in Washington when this thing actually arrived. You have bought us a what? As a result of that, we set up a project 3 years ago to actually properly investigate all of this. And I'm going to give you very, very brief headlines now as to some of the discoveries that this project has made. About a month ago, we brought together the 4 original Magna Cartas. Some of the people in this audience were there when that reunification took place. And thereafter, they were subjected to proper scientific analysis. You can see us all looking a little worried here. We have the 4 1215 Magna Cartas, but there are armed guards in that room. One of the discoveries, that burnt cotton charter, which was thought originally to come from Dover Castle, actually comes from Canterbury Cathedral. The unburnt cotton charter probably comes from the Cathedral of St. Paul's. We'll be able to prove that sooner or later because we've now looked at the back of it and seen what's written on the back of it. And one day, soon, someone will find other documents with that same writing on the back, and they will come from a cathedral archive, and we will therefore pin down where that unburnt charter came from. But the Magna Carta, the unburnt one, is already displayed in London, has been for many years, but under very subdued lighting. One of the effects of this reunification was to enable us to see the front of it. And what we can see, written down the margin of the front of it, is a whole series of writing in a late 14th century hand that suggests that sometime around 1390, someone was actually writing on one of the original Magna Cartas. That fits into what we know of the attempts made in the 1390s to reuse Magna Carta, particularly by the Duke of Gloucester, as a means of putting restraint upon the then King of England, Richard II, so that we get the reinvention of Magna Carta as a means of placing baronial control over an unjust king. A year ago in Lambeth Palace, the archive of the Archbishops of Canterbury, I found this document, very dull, very Latin, but it's nonetheless, as it were, the publication schedule for Magna Carta in the summer of 1215. It's a document that has been assumed to have existed before, because without it, Magna Carta could not have been published, but had not actually been found. It was found in pretty plain view. Not in quite such plain view as this so-called sandwich Magna Carta that you've had referred to already. In December last year, late at night in a hotel, as I will be tonight, I had nothing better to do than to trawl the internet, because I am a nerd, a medievalist. My trawling is perhaps different from that of other people late at night on the internet. I tend to look up sites for ancient manuscripts. And I found a reference to something called the Forest Charter held by the borough of Sandwich. I contacted the archivist who went and looked in the box, and what they found there was this. This is an original 1300 Magna Carta. It's been badly eaten by mice and rats and by damp, but nonetheless it's worth many millions of pounds, and nobody knew before our project that it was there. It gives some idea of the discoveries that are yet to be made. And it travelled around the world. This is the Time cover for the Sandwich Magna Carta. At the same time we brought these 4 original 1215 charters together, I was able to bring together 228 original charters of King John across the archives of the world in places as far apart as Oslo and New York. There are original charters of King John written by his scribes, 227 of them so far in 94 archives. And here we are looking at them, looking a little worried, but very soon realizing that many of them are written in the same handwriting, so that this charter to the men of Nottingham is written in the same hand as that charter to the men of Appleby, so that we have an exact match for the hands. We have an exact match for these 3 charters, part of a much larger series, all of which are written by one particular scribe. Now that enables us to begin with to actually piece together the authorship, the original handwriting of these documents, so that even with a tiny fragment like that entirely eaten by rats and mice, we can work out what the text is and what it should have said. But it leads on to a rather more exciting question, which you are the first audience, certainly on this side of the Atlantic, to hear the answer. Who actually wrote Magna Carta? This is the Lincoln Magna Carta that you had exhibited in Washington until a few weeks ago. Here's the opening and here's the closing phrase. Here is a charter granted by King John to Lincoln in July 1215. Here is the opening phrase at the bottom, and above it, Magna Carta. Here is the dating clause of that charter of July 1215 at the bottom, and above it, the dating clause of the Lincoln Magna Carta. They're written in the same hand. Here's the Salisbury Magna Carta, and here is a charter from Chippenham from the Wiltshire Record Office. Tessa Webber, my advisor on the paleography here, is not prepared to say that they are an exact match, but they are extraordinarily similar. In other words, they are written within the bishop's chancery, within the bishop's writing office, not the king's writing office, like the Lincoln Charter. Now that leads on to one rather remarkable consequence. I've talked about the bishops and the Church of England being involved in Magna Carta, but one of the founding principles of American law and American constitutionalism is that there is no state church, and that the rise of fundamentalist religions around the world is a real threat today to those of us in the free world. You should remember here that Magna Carta, as originally issued in 1215, to those who saw it, to those who saw the physical handwriting of it, would have looked not like a royal charter, but like an episcopal charter, like something produced by the church, that this was law that was emanating with God incorporated into it via the church. Indeed, if we want to find a modern comparison to it, we would look to those parts of the world today where religion and politics go hand in hand, often in a disquieting way, so far as we are concerned, in what we regard as the free English-speaking world. And all of those discoveries emerge from the fact that in 2007, the National Archives in Washington were obliged to auction their Magna Carta, and I became involved in it and realized quite how much there was still to find. And I can assure you there is a great deal more still to be found today. Thank you very much.
We have a couple of mics floating around, so if anyone wants to ask a question for Professor Vincent. What do you think the role?
What do you think the role of William Marshall was in the revision of 1216 and 17, negotiating that?
It's very difficult to say. It's very difficult to ascribe individual authorship to any particular clause, to say that Stephen Langton did this, William Marshall did the other. I think what we can say is that there were a large number of people around at the time. It's a bit like the Declaration of Independence. You know, who actually wrote that? Who actually said, no, we won't use that phrase, we'll use the other? Certainly, though, William Marshall was a very influential figure in English politics and would have played a role.
Were all documents written in the Latin there?
Yes.
Legal documents?
King John is the first king of England, in my knowledge, to have issued letters in French. He would have spoken in French, and the negotiations at Runnymede would have been conducted in French. He's the first king that I know in England to have issued documents in French, and the remarkable thing about them is that they're sort of fingers crossed behind my back sort of documents, because they say in French, I will do these sorts of things in future, but they're issued in French because that doesn't really have legal authority. So it's a way of saying, yeah, I quite like to do this, but I won't do it in Latin because then it would actually apply under law.
What precedent was there for the language that we see, the ones that you highlight here, the language that embodies rights or conceptions of rights, maybe precursors of rights? What precedent, I'm not asking about authorship, I'm asking about conceptions. Yep. Where did those come from?
Okay, so what's the most important principle of Magna Carta? That justice is not to be bought and sold. Where does that come from? It comes from the church. At least in the 12th century, the church regularly in church councils declares that justice is not to be bought and sold. But then it goes all the way back to Roman law. It goes back to the Roman tradition that law is incorruptible, that equity and justice stand above cash transfer. So in many ways, those principles of Magna Carta that enter English law and that are so fetishized are actually a great deal older than Magna Carta itself. So in a sense, with your Capitol building, with your Supreme Court, you are quite right to have built images of Magna Carta into that framework, but to have a fully classical framework, an Athenian or a Roman framework for so many of your legal buildings.
Since I incorrectly thought that 1297 was the last Magna Carta, and I thought that I'd read that there were 17, not including this 18th. Can you explain, please, what the 1300 is about and how many in total existing Magna Cartas are known today?
I am aware that I am being recorded, so I will be discreet. There were reasons when the Magna Carta was auctioned in 2007 to stop in 1297 with 17 charters. And I won't go into those reasons. But there are actually 6 or 7, one of them is very, very peculiar, reissues of 1300. The 1297 charter is interesting in all sorts of ways. The one you've got, it's sealed with a very strange seal that the king left behind in England when he went off to campaign in Flanders. And therefore, when he came back, there was obviously fear that the seal that had been used by his 15-year-old son in his absence wouldn't be recognized, wouldn't be honored by the king. So the king himself was made to reissue it under the Great Seal of England in 1300. And so we did arrive at the figure of 22 original Magna Cartas, but with the Sandwich Magna Carta, we now come up to 23. And then if we allow for the fact that there's this other one which probably isn't written in the King's Chancery, there are actually 24 originals. Now, this is not very widely known. There has never been an edition that collates all of those texts. No one has actually read all of those 24 Magna Cartas, word for word. And because each one is equally valid under English law, each one actually has the proper original text of Magna Carta, imagine if one of them says, and I declare that all jewels in England belong to the Queen, or I declare that all Fridays in March are to be bank holidays, that would necessarily be English law. Now, it isn't going to be quite as dramatic as that, but when we do eventually come to collate these texts, and that's part of what we're trying to do, we are going to find all sorts of anomalies, all sorts of interesting points that no one has looked at. This is the iconic document of legal history. It's one of the great foundational documents of the English-speaking world. There is no reliable modern edition of it.
Just immediately, are you going to publish this modern one?
Quite a lot of this is being published. We have a website online. If you go to it, it's Magna Carta Research, all one word, and you'll find all sorts of extraordinary and varying from the bizarre to the quite interesting to the very interesting, all sorts of extraordinary things on there, including the first proper commentary on Magna Carta published since the First World War by a colleague of mine called Henry Summerson. But it's ongoing, and we're actually following King John on a day-by-day basis. There's King John's diary, if you want to read it. I know because I'm writing it.
Magna Carta speaks about free people. How many free people were there in England that time? What was the sheer population that Magna Carta would be applicable?
Okay, so a large part of Magna Carta is applicable to the free men of England. And there is general agreement today that we should translate that not as men in the gendered sense, but as persons. I think that's perfectly acceptable. That there are free women and free men, and they are incorporated within that phrase. Now, to guess how many there were is really very difficult. Let us imagine that we agree that the population of England was about 3 million. And let us imagine that the number of free men was between 10 and 20% of that population. We might be talking about 250,000 people, maybe, but probably not. We're not talking about a very large number. The majority of people live as peasants. And I think that is also a very important point to bear in mind here. Now, there is another point to bear in mind here, though, which is that Magna Carta, yes, is a feudal document, and it is about barons and knights, but it includes a very important clause at the absolute end. And that clause at the end says that all the liberties that are granted here to the barons and knights must be extended by the barons and knights to their own subjects. And there we probably go beyond the free men, beyond that small elite at the top of society, to comprehend a much wider part of the population. So Magna Carta is everybody's birthright, not just the birthright of lords and ladies and barons.
They tell me this is the last question.
Good.
So pardon me for asking you to maybe repeat. At the end of the presentation, we were talking about handwriting analysis from the early 13th century. And the conclusion seems to have been that the handwriting points to ecclesiastical hand in drafting the documents, yep, rather than royal secretaries drafting it. I've been hearing until now that in fact we're looking at documents drafted by scribes in chancery and then sent out from some central point to the rest of the kingdom. In fact, what does the current research lead us to? How does the current research lead us to revise that scenario?
That Magna Carta would have died but for the fact that the bishops preserved it, and to preserve it they had to get their own copies made by their own clerks. And that if the king had had the opportunity, Magna Carta would have disappeared and never have been remembered. And it is remembered because the clerks of individual bishops took the trouble to copy it out and then preserve those copies in cathedral libraries.
Well, good. Thank you very much. And join me again, please, in thanking Professor Vincent for this fabulous discussion.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.